Mr. Johnny is working for a consultancy, Várri Consultancy. He's the founder and managing director. His background is in risk management, and after working in corporate and investment banking credit risk for almost 13 years, he established a consulting boutique in 2020. Congratulations. Been working on establishing and improving due diligence, credit risk management, general risk management, and investment committee underwriting practices of solar energy investments in companies. Welcome to our panel, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. And we are eager to hear from you about your experiences in identifying the risks and de-risking, so we can establish more solar projects. The first question would be is how to focus on on improving the risk or de-risking the solar projects. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Over to you.
Sure, thank you for that, Samer. So I think I wanted to just first start by just describing how the renewable energy sector may be slightly different from other sectors when it comes to risk management. And some of the points have been mentioned. So, for example, one of the key characteristics is that we're talking about very long-term projects, often 10 years plus, up to 20, 25 years even. So that means that there's often an embedded credit risk for a very long time, and obviously it makes it more difficult to predict the risk if you're locked into long-term contracts. Secondly, one thing that I've experienced, coming from a banking background and then moving into the renewable energy sector in terms of where my clients are, the sector is unregulated in the sense that we're not talking about regulated banks here, yet many of them have a financing element built into their business model. And that also means that there's less clear sort of guidance on how do you assess your projects, what are the criteria for evaluating a specific investment object, how do you assess your off-takers, what's an acceptable level of credit risk, what's unacceptable. So that would be like sort of the second point that I would point out as a characteristic of the sector. Thirdly, because of the sort of unregulated financing element, my experience is that it's not as clear what all the different terms mean. So we've had some of my fellow panelists have been discussing certain things being low risk and high risk. But the question is, what is low risk? What is high risk? That will depend on the investor and the investor's risk appetite, right? Lastly, many of these firms put on different hats. Or the people working in the firms put on different hats for the same project. So you don't necessarily have a specialized credit risk analyst sitting in-house. You don't have a specialized operational risk analyst sitting in-house. You may have limited in-house legal counsel. And that in itself also raises some challenges. So that's the sort of backdrop to the sector. And if we're then talking about limiting risks or de-risking, as you mentioned, I think the first step is really to create a risk framework. So you first need to have the risk management framework where you have sort of identified these terms. What do we mean by low risk, high risk? And then we can reduce it.
Sounds good. So follow up on this advice. What can the companies do in-house versus involving external advisors and consultants? What is your advice on that? Over to you.
So I think Denisa mentioned some of the challenges specific to the region, which is limited access to data. Many of the companies are not publicly rated, particularly if they're smaller corporates and privately owned. And that means that you need to have some kind of credit risk expertise in order to really assess the off-taker's risk that you're taking. And there are various models for doing that. You can either hire someone internally to do the work and setting up your own internal models. What I see is that many don't have the scale for that. So it might not be commercially viable to set up a full-blown credit risk department and have your own internal models and so on and so forth. And that's where you can bring in external expertise until you reach the point where you have the scale to hire someone internally. Then when it comes to other forms of risks, I've talked about credit risk, but if we look at the operational risk, I find that the experience is greater there because many of the people working in the industry, they have the technical background, they have the technical expertise. They fully understand how the product is built and what can go wrong with it. So I don't see as many gaps there. And that's probably something that is best done in-house anyway, because you're closer to the project as opposed to bringing someone in. And it might be more of a question of formalizing that internally. To sort of bring it back to the overall topic of raising finance, you may be doing everything right and you may know exactly what your operational risks are, whether you are happy with the credit risk and so on. Then you approach an equity investor or a debt investor, a fund or a bank, and you say that, this is what we do, but they want to see sort of the proof. So it might be a case of you doing everything right, but you need to also have it, in a format that, let's say, a conservative risk analyst at a bank likes it, which is in alphabetical order, in a nice DD room, all the policies, procedures, everything is there, showing how you comply with it. That's where it's often lacking. So one way to de-risk it is actually, to come back to your question, one way to de-risk a product at times is simply to know what the risks are. Because when you're seeking finance, credit risk manager being one myself previously, if we don't know, we will assume the worst. Yeah. So it's often better to know what your risks are in the project and clearly flag those and outline them, and then say how you're looking to address them, than to just sort of forget about them or even worse, not mention them and hide it actively. That's when warning flags are sort of shown within the bank. So.
Thank you very much, Johnny. I
And if
have
I just may,
yeah.
as an example, so I just put up a quick poll in the room on whether the audience thinks that the credit risk in the solar power sector, or the credit risk they're taking on off-takers, will it reduce, stay unchanged, or increase over the next year? And if we look at the results so far, some 14 votes, so I'm expecting another 60 or so of you to vote. But based on the votes we have now, we have half of the people say reduce and sort of 1/3 say increase. So the point being that, whatever the right answer is, people have different views of it. So you might have one view in your company, and the financier might have a completely different view. So when you're talking about de-risking, how do you define risk in your company? What do you define as a high risk or low risk? And have that transparency. You can put up a risk matrix, for example. Uh, I think it just shows that people have different views, and you need to be very transparent of what you mean exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, statistics play a big role in this. Uh, I want you to tell us about, from your experience, what happened during COVID-19. If you were managing any projects, and because of the lockdowns, energy consumption went down, and so how did that lockdown impacted the solar projects, and how is it now included in your risk matrix and future risk matrix. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when COVID hit, I was part of setting up a new digital bank, so it was not in solar sector. But I can tell you broadly what was interesting with the pandemic hitting was that working in risk management, it's not like anyone could potentially say that it was going to happen a pandemic exactly in that in that year, right? But working for banks previously, I mean, we've been modeling pandemics, we've been modeling IT security threats, natural disasters, and all of these very, very unlikely events, and having plans in place. And you know what it's like. Most people are sort of, oh, do we need to do this exercise again? Whereas in risk management, it's part of the general day-to-day work. So when this actually occurred, I feel that there's a greater respect for risk management generally. There's a greater level of awareness in all sectors, not only solar, but solar being one of them. And I saw an increase in demand for people wanting to understand what are the risks we're taking in our business, really, and how can we manage them more effectively, and actually how can we use them as a competitive advantage. And for me, it was actually the tipping point to set up the consultancy, to leave the banking world, set up the consultancy, and work with corporates on this topic. So I think that's the main impact I've seen across several industries: greater level of awareness, and also more energy to actually understand these topics and a greater interest in them.
Okay, very good. My last question to you is really about what's happening. As the solar PV market matures, you have more renewable energy, clean energy on the grid, and so the saturation level might increase. So maybe the grid operator I will ask to shut down the solar PV project when there is no demand, for example, on a weekend or during, let's say, spring.
Mm.
Uh, did you experience such, let's say, events, and how are you going? Are you modeling it in your future projects?
I've not experienced that particular scenario that you mentioned. What I would say is like this: if you think about it, I had this discussion the other day. If you think about it, you mentioned one potential scenario that could occur, right? Which would have a
Yes.
negative impact on a particular business. Now, what other scenarios could you come up with? We could probably stay here all day. It's just about up to imagination, right? There are other generic business risks, not specific to the solar sector, regarding IT security. There's a new personal data law in the UAE that just came in. How many are compliant with that within the solar energy sector, for example? There are data privacy laws, cybersecurity, and then on top of that, you have industry specific scenarios that you mentioned. You have regulations, uncertain regulations, so on. The point is that most of these events, there's a very small likelihood that they will occur, let's say in the next year, right? Might be 0.0001, yeah. But if you add up all the number of events that could happen, each of them very, very small, how many events could you come up with? You could come up probably with an unlimited number, which means that the likelihood of the scenario you just mentioned happening is probably quite small. But the likelihood that any one of those events will happen is very large because there are so many of them, right? And it's very difficult as a risk manager or as a business leader to know which one is it that's going to happen, that's going to affect my business negatively. It's very difficult to predict that. So the point is, if you have a systematic framework for identifying risks that arise, I think that's the answer to most of the issues that we've talked about, most of the risks that we've talked about. It's about having the framework in place, being vigilant, and if you can, even use them to your benefit. So perhaps the scenario you mentioned, maybe you have a specific pricing model that nobody else has that takes this into consideration. So if this risk occur, actually you're going to come out on top of it, because risks are not only, they're not only negative, there can be positive outcomes as well.
I hope so. Okay. Thank you very much, Johnny. And
Thank you.
we go over.